I am Savannah, 34 years old, and my parents skipped my husband and daughter's funeral. They called it a trivial event not worth attending while they vacationed in Aspen. Days later, they showed up at my house demanding $80,000 from my husband's life insurance to fund my brother's failing startup. Their faces turned absolutely pale when I handed them an eviction notice instead. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who only see you as a bank account. The Seattle rain did not care that I was bearing my entire world. It just fell cold and indifferent, soaking through the shoulders of my black wool coat as I stared down at the two mahogany caskets suspended over the freshly dug earth. Declan was 36 years old. Mia was 4. A drunk driver running a red light in a Ford F-150 had reduced my brilliant, loving husband and my innocent baby girl to tragic statistics on a random Tuesday afternoon. I stood completely alone under a large black umbrella. The priest's words were a droning buzz in my ears, completely drowned out by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the synthetic fabric above my head. Behind me stood Declan's business partners and a few of my colleagues from the firm. Their faces were etched with genuine horror and deep pity. They had canceled board meetings and flown across the country to stand in the freezing mud for a man they respected and the family he cherished. But the front row, the row specifically reserved for my immediate family, was completely empty. 4 folding chairs sat vacant, pooling with rainwater. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a harsh, mechanical vibration against my numb thigh. For a split second, a desperate, pathetic part of my grief-stricken brain hoped it was my father Howard calling to say they were stuck in traffic and trying their best to get here. I pulled the phone out with trembling, freezing fingers. The screen lit up through the gloomy afternoon light. It was a text message from Beverly, my mother. I wiped a raindrop from the screen and read the words that would alter the course of my life forever. She wrote that Trent's family ski trip to Aspen was booked 6 months ago, and the luxury resort was strictly non-refundable. She said a funeral is just a trivial event, a mere formality really, and told me not to make a scene about them missing it. She ended the message by saying they would send a nice wreath to my house next week and added a casually affectionate sign-off as if she were canceling a lunch date instead of skipping the burial of her son-in-law and granddaughter. I stared at the glowing pixels until the words blurred together. A trivial event. Lowering my husband, the absolute love of my life, and my 4-year-old baby girl into the freezing mud was a trivial event compared to my brother Trent's snowboarding vacation. As a corporate liquidation specialist, my entire professional life had been defined by assessing broken things. My job was to walk into bankrupt, failing companies, strip away the emotion, audit the ledgers, and cut the dead weight. I was a surgeon of failing assets. I did not deal in tears. I dealt in undeniable, cold, hard facts. Looking at my mother's text message, a profound psychological shift occurred inside me. The weeping, shattered widow, who had barely slept or eaten in a week, quietly died right there on the wet grass. In her place, the corporate liquidator took over. I did not reply to the text. I did not drop to my knees and scream at the gray sky. I simply slid the phone back into my pocket, stepped forward, and dropped a single white rose onto Mia's casket, followed by one for Declan. I turned my back on the empty family chairs and walked to my car with my head held high. They had made their choice. From this exact second forward, Howard, Beverly, and Trent were no longer my family. They were just bad assets, and I was going to liquidate them. 3 days passed. The house was a cavernous, suffocating tomb of silence. Every corner held a ghost of the life that was violently stolen from me. Declan's running shoes were still kicked off by the front door where he had left them. Mia's half-finished coloring book lay open on the kitchen island, a bright pink crayon resting right where her tiny hand had dropped it. I had spent 72 hours existing on black coffee and sheer willpower systematically packing Mia's stuffed animals into cardboard boxes because looking at them felt like swallowing crushed glass. I was taping a box shut in the nursery when the front door chimed and swung open. I had not locked it. Footsteps echoed loudly in the foyer. They were not the hesitant, respectful shuffle of friends bringing casseroles or offering quiet condolences. They were the heavy, entitled stomping of people who believed they owned the place. A voice rang out complaining about the temperature, demanding I turn up the thermostat. I froze. I walked out of the nursery and looked over the banister. Standing in my foyer, shaking snow off their designer jackets, were Howard and Beverly. They were deeply tanned from the aspen sun, looking refreshed and entirely unbothered. Beverly was adjusting her diamond earrings while Howard looked around my house with the calculating eyes of a real estate appraiser. There were no tears in their eyes, no rushed apologies for missing the funeral, no desperate hugs to comfort their grieving daughter. I stopped halfway down the stairs, my hand gripping the oak railing. I noted that they were back early, my voice eerily calm, floating down the staircase like ice. Beverly sighed, tossing her expensive leather handbag onto the credenza, right next to a framed photo of Declan. She complained that Trent had some business emergencies, so they cut the trip short by a day. She casually mentioned that the snow was getting a bit icy anyway, then flippantly asked how I was holding up and if I had sorted out the life insurance yet. I stared at her, my blood running cold. My husband was buried 3 days ago. I stated, my voice dangerously flat, and you are standing in my foyer asking about his life insurance. Beverly rolled her eyes, telling me not to be so dramatic. She actually said he was gone, and that crying was not going to bring him or Mia back. She insisted they had living family members who were in actual crisis right now. Howard stepped forward, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. He told me there was no easy way to transition into this, so he was just going to treat me like the businesswoman I am. He declared we needed to talk about Declan's policy. Howard explained that Trent's tech startup was facing a massive cash flow issue. He said Trent was about to miss payroll, and if he defaulted, he would lose his funding. He stated bluntly that Trent needed liquidity today. They knew Declan had a premium policy, and they demanded that I front Trent $80,000 immediately. I stared at the two people who had created me. My mind flashed back to when I was 22, begging them to co-sign a modest student loan so I would not have to drop out of university. They had refused, claiming I needed to learn the harsh realities of independence. I had worked night shifts scrubbing floors at a diner to pay my tuition. Meanwhile, they had drained their retirement accounts to buy Trent a luxury sports car for his college graduation because they claimed a CEO needs to project success. $80,000, I repeated, tasting the sheer audacity of the number. Beverly waved her hand dismissively, calling it just a loan. She promised Trent would pay me back with interest when his application went public next year. She told me I was sitting on a massive payout and did not need all that money sitting in a bank account while I sat around being depressed. She reminded me that my brother had 3 kids to feed. I asked coldly if Trent's wife Kendra was pregnant again. I knew Kendra was a hard-working African-American woman who practically raised those children alone while Trent played the big-shot entrepreneur. Howard snapped, losing his patience. He said Trent had a lifestyle to maintain. He insisted we were family, that family helps family, and claimed Declan would have wanted Trent to succeed. He ordered me to write the check. Declan thought Trent was an incompetent narcissist who could not balance a checkbook if his life depended on it. I said, my voice slicing through the foyer like a scalpel. And no, you are not getting a single dime of my husband's life insurance. Beverly's jaw dropped. The faux-friendly suburban mother mask shattered instantly, revealing the vicious entitlement underneath. She shrieked, asking how dare I speak about my brother that way. She called Trent an innovator and labeled me a glorified repo woman, claiming I had always been jealous of him. I let out a dry, humorless laugh as I descended the remaining stairs, stopping just inches from my father. I told her I was not jealous, but mathematically literate. Trent's app had been in beta testing for 3 years with zero revenue. It was a financial black hole. I looked them dead in the eye and said even if he were a tech genius, I would not give them the sweat off Declan's brow. I ordered them to get out of my house. Howard's face turned a mottled, furious red. He pointed a thick manicured finger at my chest. He called me a selfish brat, reminding me they raised me and put a roof over my head. He screamed that Trent was on the verge of losing everything, and if he went down, the stress would kill my mother. He delivered a final ultimatum. He told me I was going to transfer that $80,000 by tomorrow morning, or I could consider myself dead to this family. I did not blink or back down. I told him they had already made that clear when they chose fresh powder in Aspen over their granddaughter's casket. I pointed to the door behind them. I gave them 60 seconds to use it before I called the police and had them escorted off my property for trespassing. Beverly gasped, clutching her chest theatrically. She called me a sick, twisted girl and said no wonder Declan was always working late, claiming living with a cold, heartless spreadsheet like me must have been a nightmare. The mention of Declan's name from her venomous mouth made my vision narrow, but my years of corporate negotiations kept my face perfectly impassive. I stepped past them, opened the heavy oak front door, and let the freezing Seattle wind howl into the foyer. I started counting down from 60. Howard grabbed Beverly's arm, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it finally clarified every interaction I had ever had with them. I was not a daughter. I was just a bank account they had not figured out how to drain yet. Howard spat that I would regret this, warning me not to come crawling back to them when I had nothing left. I slammed the door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames, and I threw the deadbolt, officially sealing them out of my life. The silence in the foyer was deafening, but it was a clean silence, the kind that follows a surgical amputation. I stood with my back against the heavy oak door, listening to the muffled roar of Howard's SUV engine as he aggressively backed out of my driveway. He clipped the edge of my mailbox, sending a spray of icy slush into the street before speeding off. I did not move for a long time. I just breathed in the cold air of my home, finally free of their suffocating presence. The next morning, I woke up at exactly 5 o'clock. I did not sleep in, and I did not wallow in the empty bed. The corporate liquidator inside my head had fully taken the wheel. I went for a brutal 6-mile run in the freezing rain, pushing my body until the physical pain drowned out the lingering ghosts in the house. When I returned, I brewed black coffee, booted up my laptop, and prepared to organize Declan's estate documents. Before I could open the encrypted financial folders, my phone vibrated. Then it vibrated again. A relentless barrage of notifications flooded the screen. My stomach tightened. I clicked open the first notification. It was a message from my aunt, a woman who had not bothered to call me when Declan died. It read that I was a monster and asked how I could do this to my own brother. I frowned, opening my email. 3 messages from extended family sat in my inbox, all dripping with venom. I opened Facebook. The timeline loaded, and there it was. A featured post by Trent tagged with my parents and shared by dozens of local country club socialites. Trent had crafted a masterful piece of manipulative fiction. The post included a black and white photo of him looking solemn, staring out of a rainy window. The caption was a winding, emotionally manipulative essay. He wrote about how grief changes people, but he never expected it to turn his own sister into a cold-blooded monster. He claimed he had humbly approached me for a small loan to keep his revolutionary tech company afloat, purely to save the jobs of his loyal employees. Trent explicitly stated that I was sitting on millions in life insurance money, hoarding it, while my own flesh and blood faced total ruin. He painted a picture of me as an unhinged, greedy widow using the tragic deaths of my husband and daughter as an excuse to exact petty, jealous revenge on his success. He even had the audacity to write that Declan would be ashamed of my selfishness. The comments section was a digital lynch mob of people calling me heartless. The attack was not confined to family social media. Trent had taken his smear campaign to LinkedIn, tailoring the narrative for his investors and the local business community. On LinkedIn, he posted a professionally polished version of the sob story. He framed it as a harsh lesson in business resilience, claiming a vital family investor had suddenly reneged on a promised bridge loan out of sudden mental instability. He was weaponizing my grief to explain away his own financial incompetence to his shareholders. He was setting me up as the scapegoat for his impending bankruptcy. Any normal person would have been crushed. Any normal widow would have deleted her social media accounts, locked her doors, and sobbed on the bathroom floor. But I was not normal. I was a liquidation specialist. When an underperforming CEO resorts to public defamation, it means they are out of capital and out of leverage. It means they are backed into a corner and bleeding out. Trent was bleeding out. I did not reply to a single comment. I did not post a defensive rebuttal. I opened a fresh digital dossier and began taking high-resolution screenshots of every single post, every nasty comment from my parents, and every threatening message from extended family. I archived the timestamps, the URLs, and the network of people sharing the defamation. In the corporate world, this was not just a smear campaign. This was documented public libel. Trent was handing me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy his credibility when the time was right. As I compiled the screenshots, my analytical mind started dissecting the desperation behind Trent's posts. A CEO of a legitimate tech startup does not publicly beg a grieving widow for $80,000 on LinkedIn. A real venture-backed company has credit lines, emergency bridge loans from institutional investors, and corporate reserves. $80,000 was a microscopic amount for a company claiming to revolutionize the tech industry. This confirmed my initial suspicion. The $80,000 was not for payroll, it was to cover up a personal financial crime. Just as I saved the final screenshot to a secure cloud drive, a direct message popped up on my screen. It was not a threat or a judgment, it was from Kendra Trent's wife. My African-American sister-in-law had always been the only pragmatic person in that entire chaotic family. She was a brilliant hospital administrator who kept her head down and focused entirely on raising her 3 children. She tolerated my parents' toxic behavior purely to maintain peace, but she never participated in their delusions. Kendra's message was shockingly brief. She wrote that she did not know about Trent's posts until just now. She offered her condolences about Declan and Mia. She told me not to sign anything and not to give them a dime. She stated that we needed to talk, but not on this app. I stared at Kendra's message, feeling a cold spark of strategy ignite in my chest. Kendra was a fiercely protective mother. If she was reaching out to me behind Trent's back, it meant the financial rot in their household was deeper than I thought. It meant she smelled smoke and was trying to find the fire before it burned her children's future. I knew what to do. I replied to Kendra using a secure messaging application I utilized for confidential corporate communications. I told her to meet me tomorrow at a discreet coffee shop downtown, completely away from the country club circles our families frequented. I instructed her to bring any financial documents she could safely access. I hit send, placing my phone face down on the kitchen island. The digital warfare was temporarily paused, but the physical assault was just beginning. Less than an hour later, a harsh, rhythmic pounding echoed through the quiet house. It was not the entitled knocking of my parents, but the sharp, professional rapping of someone with a job to do. I walked to the front door, glancing through the peephole. A man in a cheap windbreaker stood on my porch, clutching a thick manila envelope and a clipboard. I unbolted the door and pulled it open just enough to speak. He asked if I was Savannah. I confirmed my identity, my voice devoid of any emotion. He thrust the clipboard toward me, asked for a signature, and handed over the heavy envelope. He stated that I had been officially served before turning on his heel and marching back to his unmarked sedan. I closed the door, sliding the deadbolt back into place. I carried the envelope to Declan's immaculate mahogany dining table, grabbing a silver letter opener to slice through the thick paper. Inside was a stack of legal documents bearing the letterhead of a notoriously aggressive law firm located in a strip mall 2 towns over. It was exactly the kind of firm desperate people hired when they needed to bully someone through intimidation rather than actual legal merit. The top document was a notice of intent to file a lien against my primary residence. I read the opening paragraphs, feeling my pulse slow to a steady, calculating rhythm. According to the document, my father Howard was formally claiming an equitable interest in my property. The legal filing alleged that 5 years ago, during the purchase of this home, Howard had provided Declan with a $50,000 handshake loan. The document claimed this money was explicitly intended to cover the closing costs and a portion of the down payment, with the verbal agreement that it would be repaid upon demand. Because Declan was deceased, Howard demanded immediate repayment from the estate. If I did not surrender the funds within 10 days, his attorney would file a formal lien against my deed. The sheer audacity of the fabrication was almost impressive. Howard had never given Declan a single cent. In fact, Howard was perpetually drowning in credit card debt and taking out second mortgages just to maintain his country club memberships and lease his luxury vehicles. When Declan and I bought this house, Declan had paid the 20% down payment entirely in cash, pulling the funds directly from a successful venture capital exit. Howard had actually complained at our housewarming party that our home was too ostentatious and criticized Declan for not investing that capital into Trent's garbage startup. I scrutinized the attached exhibits. There were no bank transfer records, no signed promissory notes, and no emails discussing the alleged loan. The entire claim rested on a sworn affidavit signed by Howard and magically corroborated by a second sworn statement from Trent, who claimed he was present in the room when this supposed handshake deal took place. It was a coordinated, premeditated perjury. My mind, trained by years of corporate liquidation, instantly dismantled their strategy. This was not a lawsuit designed to be won in a courtroom. Howard's strip mall attorney knew the case would disintegrate under the scrutiny of a basic financial audit. This was a classic legal strike designed for one purpose only, which was leverage. By filing a notice of intent to lien, Howard was attempting to freeze my assets. A cloud on the title of my house would prevent me from selling it, refinancing it, or taking out a line of credit. Furthermore, dragging Declan's estate into contested probate litigation would freeze the life insurance payouts and any joint bank accounts until a judge could review the claims. Howard and Trent were betting that I was a fragile, terrified widow who would be paralyzed by the prospect of a lengthy, expensive court battle. They were betting that I would eventually capitulate and hand over the $80,000 they originally demanded just to make the lien go away and secure my financial freedom. It was a standard corporate shakedown tactic, typically used by parasitic hedge funds trying to force a hostile takeover. It was entirely devoid of morality, decency, or familial loyalty. They were weaponizing the legal system to hold my husband's estate hostage while his grave was not even a week old. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have immediately dialed their family, sobbing, begging them to drop the lawsuit, asking why they were doing this. But I did not feel panic. I felt a cold, crystalline fury solidifying in my veins. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a grieving wife who let her husband handle the finances. They forgot that I dismantled fraudulent companies for a living. I spent my days hunting down hidden assets, exposing cooked books, and annihilating executives who tried to hide their financial crimes behind legal loopholes. To defeat a fraudulent lien, I needed an overwhelming, irrefutable paper trail. I needed Declan's absolute, unvarnished financial history to prove that every penny used to purchase this house came from his legitimate venture capital earnings. I needed to show the judge that Howard's financial status made it mathematically impossible for him to have loaned anyone $50,000 5 years ago. I gathered the legal documents and walked purposefully down the hallway toward Declan's private home office. I had kept the door shut since the funeral, unable to face the scent of his cedarwood cologne or the sight of his perfectly organized desk. But the time for mourning had passed. The time for war had arrived. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, turning it with a decisive click. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the Seattle rain. I flicked on the overhead light, illuminating the dual monitors, and the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor beneath the window. It was time to open the fortress. I stepped fully into the room, closing the door firmly behind me. The heavy silence of the office pressed against my ears. Declan was a man who lived his professional life in absolute secrecy. He structured complex venture capital deals, handling millions of dollars across dozens of portfolios. His safe was a state-of-the-art biometric and digital keypad vault. A normal person would have called a locksmith or spent weeks filing probate paperwork to get a court order. I did not have weeks. I had days before Howard's frivolous lien paralyzed my assets. I walked around the mahogany desk and knelt on the thick wool rug. I stared at the digital interface. Declan never wrote his codes down on sticky notes. He despised terrible security hygiene. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that human beings, even brilliant ones, are creatures of habit. They build their security protocols around things they subconsciously prioritize. I tried the obvious choices first. Our wedding anniversary, Mia's birthday, his social security number backward. The keypad blinked a harsh red light denying me access. I sat back on my heels, closing my eyes and breathing in the scent of his cologne still lingering in the upholstery of his office chair. I needed to think like a liquidator hunting for a hidden offshore account. People hide their most secure data inside layers of misdirection. I opened his desk drawers. Everything was perfectly organized. Pens, notepads, a leather-bound planner. I picked up the planner. It was empty. Declan kept everything digital. I turned my attention to the dual monitors on his desk. I booted up the main tower. A password prompt appeared. I typed in the name of his favorite childhood dog, combined with the year his grandfather died. The screen unlocked immediately. I had watched his fingers move across the keyboard too many times not to memorize the cadence of his keystrokes. Once inside his desktop, I bypassed the standard folders and opened his secure cloud storage application. It required a two-factor authentication token. I reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, running my hand along the underside of the wooden panel until my fingers brushed against a piece of heavy-duty tape. I peeled it off, revealing a small encrypted USB drive. I plugged it into the tower. The drive executed a script bypassing the authentication protocol and granting me access to his private digital vault. I was not looking for bank statements just yet. I was looking for the master recovery key for the physical safe. I scrolled through encrypted text files until I found a document simply labeled Insurance. I opened it. It was not a life insurance policy. It was a string of 16 alphanumeric characters. The factory reset code for the floor safe. I returned to the safe, inputting the 16-digit override code on the keypad. A satisfying heavy metallic click echoed through the room. I grabbed the chrome handle and pulled the thick steel door open. The interior was entirely devoid of cash or jewelry. Declan did not hoard physical wealth. He hoarded information. Inside lay several perfectly aligned stacks of manila folders, a velvet box containing his grandfather's watch, and a thick black leather-bound ledger wrapped tightly in clear tamper-evident security tape. The tape was a clear indicator that the contents were highly classified even by his strict standards. I pulled the ledger out, setting it on the center of his desk. I grabbed a pair of scissors and sliced through the security tape. The binding cracked slightly as I opened the heavy cover. The first page was entirely blank except for a single line of text printed in the center. It read M&S Holdings LLC. I traced the letters with my index finger. M&S, Mia, and Savannah. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp pang of grief threatening to break my concentration. But I pushed the emotion down, locking it away in a dark corner of my mind. There was no room for tears anymore. Crying would not protect my daughter's memory. Dismantling the people who tried to profit off her death would. I turned the page and immediately shifted into full forensic auditing mode. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, dates, and capitalization tables. M&S Holdings was a private equity shell company. It was fully funded by Declan's personal capital, deliberately structured in Delaware to maintain absolute anonymity. The company was designed to issue high-yield convertible debt to desperate startups that traditional banks refused to touch. I flipped through the transaction logs. Declan had used this entity to bail out several companies taking aggressive equity positions when they inevitably defaulted on their loans. He was operating as a shadow angel investor, leveraging his personal wealth to generate massive, untraceable returns. It was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely legal. He had built a financial fortress specifically designed to protect his assets from external liabilities. I needed to find the connection to Howard's fake $50,000 loan. I needed the smoking gun that would obliterate my father's legal strike and leave his attorney facing disbarment for filing fraudulent claims. I cross-referenced the dates of our house purchase with the ledger's outbound cash flows. I checked the wire transfer logs, the routing numbers, and the corresponding bank receipts. There was no $50,000 transfer. Howard's claim was a complete fabrication, just as I knew it was. The money for our down payment had originated directly from a legitimate stock liquidation within Declan's primary brokerage account. But as I continued auditing the ledger, looking for any mention of my family's names, my finger stopped on an entry dated exactly 2 years ago. It was a massive outbound wire transfer categorized under mezzanine financing, $1.5 million. The recipient account belonged to a corporate entity called Apex Innovations Incorporated. My heart slammed against my ribs. Apex Innovations was Trent's company. 2 years ago, Trent had been parading around family dinners bragging about securing a massive round of angel investment that saved his application from going under. He had claimed the investors were highly exclusive Silicon Valley heavyweights who demanded absolute anonymity. Howard and Beverly had gloated for months about Trent's undeniable genius, using his success to justify why they had never helped me pay for college. They claimed his brilliance was finally being recognized by the market. They had no idea. Trent had no idea. The anonymous Silicon Valley heavyweight who saved his pathetic failing business was the man whose funeral they had just refused to attend. Declan had bailed out my brother. I stared at the ledger, my mind racing through the implications. Why would Declan give $1.5 million to a man he openly despised? Declan was not a charity. He never made an investment without securing airtight collateral. He would never throw 7 figures at Trent's vaporware startup unless he held a loaded gun to Trent's financial head. I turned the page to the collateralization agreement attached to the Apex Innovations loan. I needed to see what Trent had put up to guarantee the debt. I needed to see the trap Declan had set. I began reading the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the asset forfeiture clauses and the personal guarantor signatures. What I found on the next page made the remaining breath leave my lungs, swiftly replaced by a cold, terrifying sense of absolute power. The document was a commercial pledge agreement. Trent had not secured the loan with his startup's intellectual property. Declan knew the software code was worthless. Institutional investors require hard assets to back a mezzanine loan. Trent put up real estate. I ran my finger down the property description block. It listed a familiar residential address. It was a sprawling colonial house in an exclusive suburban community. It was the house where I grew up, where my parents currently lived. Howard and Beverly signed over the deed to their primary residence as collateral for Trent's loan. I slowly flipped to the final signature page. There they were, Howard's aggressive autograph and Beverly's elegant cursive, both notarized and stamped by a certified public accountant. Trent had legally listed them as unconditional financial guarantors. When Howard bragged about his property portfolio at charity dinners, he stood on absolute sand. He and Beverly willingly signed a quitclaim deed disguised as a commercial guarantee. They surrendered their most valuable asset to fuel Trent's delusion of grandeur. Their arrogance matched their profound financial ignorance, blindly signing their lives away to an anonymous entity. The breathtaking irony struck me like a physical blow. Hours ago, Howard stood in my foyer screaming that I owed him $50,000 for a fake handshake loan. He threatened to place a lien on my home and drag my husband's estate through probate court. He called my daughter's funeral a trivial event. Meanwhile, my husband held a legally binding commercial lien against Howard's estate. If Trent missed a payment or breached any financial covenants, M&S Holdings had the unilateral right to execute an immediate foreclosure. The contract included a waiver of default notices, meaning the creditor never had to issue a warning. Declan built a financial guillotine, positioned the blade over their necks, and handed me the lever. I sat back in Declan's leather chair, staring at the ceiling. The gaslighting, psychological abuse, and relentless financial favoritism they showered on Trent my entire life suddenly crystallized into this single pathetic document. Howard and Beverly viewed Trent as their golden ticket, the tech visionary who would elevate their status at the local country club. They were so blinded by their obsession with his projected success that they bet their house on him. Trent, the supposed Silicon Valley genius, was so incompetent that he secretly crawled to an anonymous private equity firm just to keep his servers running. He had no idea the ruthless, faceless corporate entity holding the deed to his parents' house was actually controlled by the brother-in-law he constantly belittled. Declan was a mastermind. He never told me about this because he knew my residual familial guilt might have compelled me to intervene. But by sealing it in his safe with a letter transferring sole executive control to me, he ensured I would only find this weapon when I absolutely needed it. He knew upon his death they would swarm like vultures to pick my bones clean. He gave me the power to liquidate the vultures. I leaned forward and studied the repayment schedule attached to the promissory note. The loan was structured as a convertible debt instrument with strict monthly interest payments. I cross-referenced the payment schedule with the inbound wire transfer logs in the ledger. Trent had been making the interest payments on time for the first 18 months. But over the last 6 months, payments became erratic. I checked the most recent log. Trent missed the last 2 interest payments entirely. According to the contract, a 90-day cure period was currently active. I calculated the dates in my head. The cure period was set to expire in exactly 4 days. If the arrears were not brought current by the end of business on Friday, the loan would enter terminal default. The missing arrears calculated on the page totaled exactly $80,000. A sharp, predatory laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet home office. The puzzle pieces snapped together with absolute perfection. Trent was not missing payroll. Trent was not trying to save his loyal employees. Trent was 4 days away from defaulting on a massive corporate loan that would trigger the automatic foreclosure of Howard and Beverly's house. He was panicked. He needed exactly $80,000 to cure the default and buy himself another month of breathing room. Instead of admitting to his parents that he was about to render them homeless, he sent them to my house to shake me down for my husband's life insurance money. They aggressively demanded I hand over $80,000 so Trent could secretly pay it right back to my own company. It was spectacular financial cannibalism. They tried using my tragedy to fund their survival, completely unaware I held their execution warrant. I closed the ledger, the heavy leather cover slapping loudly against the polished mahogany desk. I no longer felt the crushing weight of grief that had paralyzed me at the cemetery. The sorrow was entirely consumed by a hyper-focused analytical drive. Howard wanted to play legal games with a fake $50,000 lien against my house. I was going to respond by legally evicting him from his. As a professional liquidator, I knew better than to strike blindly. Before I executed the callable debt clause and initiated the foreclosure, I needed to know exactly why Trent's company was suddenly failing to make its interest payments. If his startup had been running on fumes for years, what specific event had caused the cash flow to completely dry up over the last 6 months? I urgently needed to audit Trent's internal corporate financials. Since M&S Holdings was his primary creditor, the contract stipulated Trent had to submit quarterly financial disclosures to the anonymous company. I just needed to log into the corporate portal Declan set up and download the raw data. I reached for the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys, ready to dissect my brother's fraudulent empire line by line. I slowly logged into the secured and hidden corporate portal Declan had established for M&S Holdings. The digital interface was extremely minimalist, requiring multiple complex layers of authentication that I easily bypassed using the master security key I had retrieved from the floor safe. A detailed dashboard quickly populated on my screen, displaying the active debt portfolio. I clicked directly on the profile for Apex Innovations Incorporated and initiated a bulk download of their mandatory quarterly financial disclosures. My large monitors quickly filled with spreadsheets, expense ledgers, and cash flow statements. This was now my domain. I was a surgeon, and these numbers were the arteries of Trent's failing business. At first glance, the financial reports looked perfectly standard. Trent had employed an accountant who knew how to dress up a corpse, masking the hemorrhaging cash burn rate with inflated revenue projections and creative categorization. But I was not a junior analyst. I was a corporate liquidator who specialized in finding the rot hidden beneath glossy pitch decks. I isolated the operating expenses over the past 6 months, the exact period when Trent stopped making his interest payments to M&S Holdings. If a tech startup suddenly stopped servicing its debt, the capital must have been diverted somewhere else. I ran a comparative analysis between the projected budget and the actual bank disbursement logs. It took me less than 20 minutes to spot the anomaly. There was a recurring outbound cash flow disguised as software licensing fees paid to a third-party vendor called Horizon Solutions. The vendor profile looked completely legitimate on paper, but the payment structure was entirely wrong for a software-as-a-service contract. The disbursements were erratic, often issued in large lump sums, rather than predictable monthly subscriptions. I ran a quick background check on Horizon Solutions using corporate registry databases. The company was registered to a post office box in Nevada, and its sole managing member was listed under the name Monica Reynolds. The total amount siphoned into Horizon Solutions over the last 2 fiscal quarters matched the missing interest payments perfectly. Trent had diverted exactly $80,000 from his operating capital into this dummy vendor account. I needed to know exactly where that money went after it hit the Nevada account. Using advanced financial tracking tools I maintained for my liquidation work, I pierced the corporate veil of Horizon Solutions. The bank routing details connected to the dummy account painted a sickening picture. The so-called software licensing fees were actually paying the monthly lease on a brand new Porsche Panamera. Trent regularly drove a Porsche around town, proudly claiming he bought it with his visionary tech earnings. But the sports car was just the beginning. The rest of the embezzled funds were paying for a luxury high-rise apartment downtown and a series of exorbitant credit card bills featuring charges from designer boutiques, high-end jewelers, and luxury resorts. I cross-referenced the name Monica Reynolds with public social media profiles. It took mere seconds to find her. She was a 24-year-old aspiring influencer whose feed was flooded with photos of expensive dinners, tropical vacations, and the interior of a very familiar-looking Porsche Panamera. In several photos, a man's arm or profile was visible in the frame. The highly expensive gold watch on the man's wrist was completely unmistakable. It was the exact same limited edition timepiece Howard had gifted Trent for his 30th birthday. The truth hit me with absolute clarity. Trent was not just an incompetent tech founder failing to manage his cash flow. He was actively embezzling investor capital to fund an extravagant double life and finance a secret mistress. The $80,000 he desperately needed from my husband's life insurance was not meant to save his loyal employees or keep the company servers running. It was the exact amount required to replenish the looted corporate accounts before his mandatory annual audit next month. If his board of directors or his remaining investors discovered the missing $80,000, Trent would not just lose his company. Embezzling corporate funds across state lines to a dummy corporation constituted federal wire fraud. Trent was facing years in federal prison. He sent Howard and Beverly to my house to shake me down for cash to cover his criminal tracks. They were willing to bankrupt me to keep their golden boy out of a federal penitentiary, even if they did not know the full extent of his crimes. I sat back in the glow of the dual monitors processing the magnitude of my brother's stupidity. Trent was a walking liability, destroying everything and everyone attached to him. He had collateralized his parents' home and stolen from his own company to fund his narcissism. But there was one person in Trent's life who did not deserve to be destroyed by the blast radius of his impending implosion. My sister-in-law, Kendra. She was a brilliant, hard-working African-American woman who managed a massive hospital wing while practically raising her 3 children alone. Kendra was grounded in reality. She never bought into Howard and Beverly's pretentious country club facade. She stayed out of the family drama, focusing entirely on her kids and her career. I knew Kendra tolerated Trent's ego because she believed he was genuinely trying to build a future for their family. She had no idea he was siphoning their future to pay for a sports car and an influencer mistress. If I was going to detonate Trent's life and legally foreclose on Howard and Beverly's house, I needed to make sure innocent people were not trapped under the rubble. Kendra needed to know the truth before the federal authorities started seizing marital assets. More importantly, Kendra was smart. If I showed her the financial evidence, she would not protect a man who was stealing from their children. She would protect her offspring. I needed an inside ally to help me execute the final blow at Trent's upcoming country club fundraiser, and Kendra was the key. I picked up my cell phone and dialed her private number. The line connected on the second ring. Kendra answered with the crisp, efficient tone of a woman who managed a hospital wing and 3 young boys simultaneously. She stated her name sharply, expecting a work emergency or a school nurse calling about a scraped knee. I took a steadying breath, shifting my posture in Declan's leather chair. I told her it was Savannah and asked if she had a secure minute to speak. A heavy pause hung on the line. Kendra and I had never been close, mostly because she wisely avoided the toxic orbit of my parents and Trent's massive ego. She attended the mandatory holidays, brought excellent wine, and left exactly when the passive-aggressive comments began. She was a master of boundaries. I respected her immensely for it. She told me she was sorry about Declan and Mia, her voice softening slightly, but retaining its characteristic firmness. She said she had sent a card because she knew my parents would turn any physical visit into a circus. I thanked her, confirming her instincts were perfectly accurate. Then I cut straight to the chase. I told her I did not call to cry about my grief. I called because I needed to meet her in person today, entirely off the record. I added that Trent could not know. Kendra was silent for a long moment. The background noise of hospital intercoms echoed faintly through the receiver. She did not ask if I was being dramatic. She did not gaslight me. She simply asked where and when. I gave her the address of a quiet, independent coffee shop located 3 blocks from her hospital. A place strictly outside the pretentious suburban bubble where Howard and Beverly spent their days pretending to be wealthy. I told her to meet me at 4 o'clock right after her shift ended. She agreed and hung up. I spent the next few hours compiling the physical evidence. I printed the commercial pledge agreement showing the collateralization of my parents' house. I printed the wire transfer logs detailing the embezzlement to the Nevada Shell Company. I printed the photographs of Monica Reynolds posing in the leased Porsche Panamera. I placed every document into a thick black binder. I was going to war, and I was bringing a tactical nuke to a knife fight. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee and sat in a secluded corner booth facing the door. Promptly at 4 o'clock, Kendra walked in. She wore tailored charcoal scrubs, her hair styled in immaculate braids. Even exhausted, she possessed an undeniable commanding presence. She spotted me immediately, grabbed a green tea from the counter, and slid into the booth across from me. She did not offer fake platitudes. She took a sip of her tea and looked me dead in the eye. She noted that I looked like a woman who had just found a loaded gun. She asked what Trent had done. I did not open the binder right away. I needed to gauge her current level of suspicion. I asked her if Trent had been acting erratically over the last 6 months. I watched her dark eyes narrow. She let out a dry, bitter laugh. She told me erratic was an understatement. She explained that Trent was constantly locking his phone, taking sudden weekend trips he claimed were vital networking retreats, and throwing tantrums whenever she asked to review their joint tax returns. Kendra leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She revealed that 2 weeks ago, a piece of mail arrived at their house that Trent failed to intercept. It was a late notice for a credit card she did not recognize, bearing a massive balance. When she confronted him, he gaslit her. He claimed it was a corporate expense card and told her she simply did not understand high-level startup financing. She said she knew he was lying, but she needed concrete proof before she upended her children's lives. She demanded to know what I had in the black binder. I placed my hands flat on the table. I told her that my parents had ambushed me yesterday. I explained they aggressively demanded $80,000 from Declan's life insurance, claiming Trent needed it to cover an emergency payroll shortage to save his startup. Kendra's face hardened into a mask of pure, controlled rage. She stated fiercely that she would never allow her husband to shake down a grieving widow. She apologized that my parents had stooped to that level of depravity. I held up a hand, stopping her apology. I told her that the $80,000 was not for payroll. I explained that Trent's company was a financial corpse. I finally opened the black binder. I slid the first document across the table. It was the financial ledger showing the recurring wire transfers to Horizon Solutions. I watched Kendra's eyes scan the numbers. Her sharp mind processed the data instantly. She pointed at the Nevada address and asked what Horizon Solutions was. I slid the printed photographs across the table next. The pictures of the 24-year-old influencer posing in the Porsche Panamera, wearing designer clothes and sporting Trent's distinct gold watch in the background. I told Kendra her husband was not a tech visionary. I stated clearly that Trent was actively embezzling corporate funds to finance a secret mistress and a luxury apartment downtown. I explained that the $80,000 he sent my parents to extort from me was the exact amount he needed to cover his tracks before a mandatory financial audit exposed his wire fraud. Kendra did not cry. She did not scream or throw her tea. A lesser woman would have shattered right there in the booth. Kendra simply closed her eyes, took a deep, stabilizing breath, and opened them again. The vulnerability was completely gone, replaced by the fierce, calculating instinct of a mother preparing to protect her young. She looked at the photos of the mistress, her expression turning lethal. She quietly stated that Trent had destroyed their family. She asked about the other documents. She recognized that I had not called her just to expose an affair. She knew I had a larger objective. I nodded, respecting her intuition. I told her this concerned her children's future. I slid the commercial pledge agreement across the table. I watched her read the collateral clauses. I explained that Declan had been the anonymous angel investor who bailed out Trent 2 years ago. I revealed that Trent had secretly collateralized Howard and Beverly's house to secure the funding. I explained that because Trent had stopped paying interest to fund his mistress, the loan was 4 days from terminal default. Kendra looked up, shock finally registering on her face. She saw the trap. She stated that I held the debt. She realized I had the legal right to foreclose on my parents' house and force Trent's company into immediate bankruptcy. I nodded. I told her I was going to execute the callable debt clause at Trent's upcoming country club fundraiser. I was going to annihilate him publicly. But before I dropped the bomb, I needed to make sure she and her children were not caught in the financial crossfire. I told her we needed to audit her personal accounts immediately because a man willing to embezzle from his own company and bankrupt his parents would absolutely steal from his own children to save himself. Kendra stared at me, the implication of my words hanging in the air between us like a physical weight. The coffee shop around us faded into a low hum of white noise as she processed the horrifying reality of what her husband was truly capable of doing. She did not waste time crying. She did not offer excuses. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver laptop, slamming it down onto the small wooden table. She told me she managed all the household finances, but Trent had insisted on maintaining sole executive control over the investment portfolios and the children's educational trusts, claiming his Silicon Valley connections offered better yield rates. I watched her fingers fly across the keyboard as she booted up the machine. I pulled my chair around the table to sit beside her, our shoulders practically touching as we formed a united front against the man who had betrayed us both. Kendra logged into their primary banking portal. The checking and savings accounts looked normal, sustaining their affluent suburban lifestyle with just enough cushion to maintain the facade. I instructed her to dig deeper. I told her to look at the 529 college savings plans. She navigated to the investment dashboard. She clicked on the specific tab designated for their 3 sons. The loading icon spun for an agonizing second before the data populated on the screen. Kendra stopped breathing. Her hands froze completely still above the keyboard. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the harsh, undeniable numbers. The 3529 accounts, which should have contained hundreds of thousands of dollars accumulated over the last decade of careful saving, were completely decimated. The balances for all 3 boys read identically, $0 and 0 cents. Kendra let out a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob. It was the primal, visceral sound of a mother realizing her children's future had been stolen and set on fire by their own father. She clicked frantically on the transaction history, desperation finally breaking through her immaculate composure. The ledger revealed a systematic, ruthless plundering. Starting exactly 6 months ago, right around the time Trent stopped paying his corporate interest to M&S Holdings and started funding his mistress's luxury lifestyle, he had initiated a series of massive withdrawals. I pointed to the transaction codes on the screen. I explained that Trent had incurred massive financial penalties and brutal tax liabilities by withdrawing those funds for non-educational purposes. He had willingly slashed his own children's future capital just to get liquid cash into his hands immediately. I traced the routing numbers on the screen. The money had not gone into their joint checking account. It had been funneled directly into a separate individual brokerage account, registered solely under Trent's name. From there, the funds had vanished, likely used to cover margin calls, fund the Nevada Shell Company, or pay off whatever other dark debts he had accumulated behind his fake innovator persona. Kendra pushed the laptop away, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She looked at me, her dark eyes hollowed out, stripped of any lingering loyalty to her marriage. She stated, her voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating whisper that he stole from his own flesh and blood. She said she had worked 80-hour weeks at the hospital, taking grueling night shifts and managing impossible administrative burdens just to ensure her boys would never have to take out a single student loan. She had built that safety net with her own sweat, and Trent had liquidated it to buy a Porsche for a 24-year-old influencer. I placed my hand over hers. It was cold as ice. I told her that parasites do not care who they bleed dry. They only care about their survival. I reminded her that Howard and Beverly were perfectly willing to let me bankrupt myself to save Trent, and Trent was willing to bankrupt his children to save himself. They were infected with the same narcissistic rot. Kendra took a deep breath, locking her emotions away. The shattered wife vanished, replaced by a calculating adversary. She turned to me, her expression hardening into absolute granite, and asked what we needed to do next. I told her the country club fundraiser was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday night. Trent and my parents were hosting a massive gala to pitch his startup to the wealthiest local investors, desperately hoping to secure a new round of funding to cover the gaping holes in his balance sheet. I explained that I was going to walk into that ballroom and publicly execute the callable debt clause. I was going to seize his company and foreclose on Howard and Beverly's house in front of every single elite socialite they had spent decades trying to impress. But I added, stepping back to look her in the eye, I needed her to strike the final blow. I told her that when I destroyed his company, he would immediately pivot to playing the victim. He would look to her for support, hoping to use his family man image to salvage whatever scraps of dignity he had left. I told her she needed to drop the guillotine on his personal life the exact second I dropped it on his professional life. Kendra did not hesitate. She asked for my corporate lawyer's contact information. She stated she was going to file for an emergency ex parte hearing tomorrow morning. She was going to present the evidence of his wire fraud and the theft of the 529 plans to a family court judge. She planned to secure a total asset freeze on all of Trent's personal accounts and file immediate divorce papers. She promised me that by Saturday night Trent would not be able to buy a coffee without court approval. I looked across the small wooden table at this phenomenal woman. Kendra did not shed a single tear for the death of her marriage. Her grief had been instantly incinerated by the fierce protective instinct of a mother fighting for her children's survival. She grabbed a pen from her bag and began jotting down the contact information I recited for my corporate legal team. I assured her they were absolute shark specialists in forensic asset recovery who would gladly coordinate with her family law attorney to ensure Trent could not hide a single dime before the gavel fell. We spent the next 2 hours turning that corner booth into a war room. We were two women chronically underestimated by the exact same toxic family, and now we were quietly orchestrating their total annihilation over lukewarm green tea. I walked Kendra through the precise timeline of the upcoming Saturday night gala. The country club fundraiser was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock. Trent had invited over 200 guests, comprising the wealthiest venture capitalists, angel investors, and socialites in the greater Seattle area. He was planning a massive presentation at 8 o'clock, a desperate pitch to secure bridge funding under the guise of expanding his visionary platform. I told Kendra that 8 o'clock was our strike hour. I would allow him to take the stage. I would let him build himself up, let him soak in the applause of the local elite, and let him leverage his fake grief over my husband to manipulate the audience. The higher he climbed, the more devastating the impact would be when I shattered the floor beneath him. Kendra leaned in, her dark eyes flashing with lethal precision. She explained her side of the execution. She would attend the gala playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife. She would wear the designer dress smile for the photographers and stand right by his side as he schmoozed the investors. She knew Trent relied on her pristine reputation as a dedicated hospital administrator to lend him credibility. She would give him that false sense of security right up until the second I hijacked the projector. We synchronized our legal strikes. My attorneys were already drafting the formal notice of acceleration for the commercial debt. Because Trent had breached the financial covenants and missed his cure period M&S, Holdings had the unilateral right to demand immediate repayment of the entire $1.5 million principal, plus all accrued interest and penalties. When a creditor issues a notice of acceleration, it instantly renders the company insolvent. At the exact same time, my team was finalizing the notice of default and foreclosure on the collateralized asset, which was Howard and Beverly's house. I was going to have the physical documents served to them directly at their VIP table during the gala. Kendra nodded, her pen flying across her notepad as she mapped out her legal filings. She promised to meet with her family law attorney the very next morning. By presenting the hard evidence of Trent draining the 529 college funds and funneling marital assets to a shell company for a mistress, she had grounds for an emergency ex parte hearing. A judge would grant an immediate freezing order on all his personal bank accounts, his stock portfolios, and his passport. She would have the divorce papers and the asset freeze orders finalized and sealed in a folder ready to hand to him on stage. We also needed to ensure Trent had absolutely no escape routes once the trap sprang closed. I pulled my laptop back over and logged deeper into the M&S Holdings administrative portal. As his primary creditor, my company held a senior secured position over all of Apex Innovations' intellectual property and banking accounts. I initiated a series of automated banking blocks that would go live the second the debt was officially called. Trent would not be able to transfer a single dollar out of his corporate accounts to hide it. I even drafted a mass email to his board of directors and secondary investors scheduled to send automatically at 8:15 on Saturday night. The email contained the forensic audit proving his embezzlement. Kendra watched me work, her expression a mix of awe and cold satisfaction. She stated that my parents had severely miscalculated when they decided to declare war on me. I kept my eyes on the screen verifying the automated locks. I told her they mistook my silence for weakness. They assumed my grief made me a vulnerable target, completely forgetting that my entire career was built on dismantling fraudulent enterprises and liquidating toxic liabilities. We closed our laptops, the glow of the screens fading to black. The plan was flawless, mathematically precise, and entirely legal. We were not seeking petty revenge. We were executing a coordinated financial and legal correction. Trent had stolen from his investors, stolen from his children, and collateralized his parents' home to fund a mistress. Howard and Beverly had enabled his narcissism, gaslit me for decades, and attempted to extort a grieving widow. They were all about to face the unmitigated consequences of their actions. Kendra gathered her things, slipping the black binder of evidence safely into her large tote bag. She stood up, looking down at me with a profound sense of mutual respect. She thanked me for not letting her go down with his sinking ship. I stood up and met her gaze. I told her that queens do not sink with jesters. We shook hands, a firm binding pact between two survivors ready to become conquerors. She walked out of the quiet coffee shop completely ready for tomorrow's impending legal battle. Friday night finally arrived. The critical cure period deadline for Trent to cover his defaulted corporate loan payments officially expired. I sat absolutely alone in Declan's quiet office, intently watching the glowing digital clock. Midnight finally struck. The massive trap was irrevocably set. Tomorrow they would all completely burn. Saturday evening descended on the Oak Ridge Country Club with a sickeningly perfect display of suburban wealth. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open doors of imported luxury sedans. The grand ballroom was bathed in the warm golden glow of crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played a lively symphony in the corner, drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the obnoxious laughter of the local venture capital elite. Trent spared absolutely no expense for his fraudulent gala. Towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas sat atop every table. A massive digital banner spanned the back wall displaying the Apex Innovations logo and a ridiculous slogan about revolutionizing tomorrow. It was a masterpiece of financial deception paid for with stolen money. I pulled my car up to the valet stand. I did not drive a leased sports car. I drove the sleek black sedan Declan and I purchased outright 2 years ago. I stepped out into the crisp evening air entirely encased in my professional armor. I wore a tailored midnight black crepe dress that fell perfectly below my knees, paired with a structured blazer that screamed corporate executioner. I wore no flashy jewelry, only my platinum wedding band and the diamond studs Declan gave me the day Mia was born. My hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon. I looked exactly like what I was, which was a predator walking into a room full of unsuspecting prey. I bypassed the red carpet photo backdrop Trent set up in the foyer, striding directly toward the carved mahogany doors of the main ballroom. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmospheric pressure in the room visibly shifted. My family spent the last several days running a highly coordinated smear campaign against me across every social circle in the city. They painted me as a greedy, unhinged widow who lost her mind with grief, a selfish monster hoarding life insurance money while her hard-working brother tried to save his visionary company. As I glided across the polished marble floor, the conversations nearest to me abruptly died. The silence rippled outward like a shockwave. Eyes darted in my direction. Women in expensive silk gowns leaned in to whisper behind their manicured hands. Men in tailored tuxedos nudged each other, stealing calculating glances. I could practically hear the venomous gossip buzzing through the air. They expected a weeping, disheveled wreck to stumble through the doors, begging for family forgiveness. Instead, they got a razor-sharp liquidator ready to buy the entire building and fire everyone inside it. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a towering marble pillar at the edge of the room. It gave me a perfect vantage point to survey the battlefield. Across the ballroom, Howard and Beverly were holding court at the primary VIP table. They looked absolutely ridiculous. Beverly wore a sequined gown that cost more than my first car, laughing loudly, with the wife of a prominent real estate developer. Howard stood beside her, swirling a glass of scotch, projecting the image of the proud, successful patriarch. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the deed to the house they slept in was currently sitting inside my black leather briefcase. Then I spotted Trent. He was standing near the stage, surrounded by a group of older angel investors. He was wearing a custom tuxedo and flashing that charismatic, empty smile he used to charm gullible people out of their capital. He was pointing to the digital banner, undoubtedly pitching the bright future of Apex Innovations. He was playing the role of the visionary tech founder to absolute perfection, completely unaware that the countdown clock on his corporate survival had officially hit zero. I scanned the room for my ally. I found Kendra standing slightly behind Trent. She looked breathtaking in an emerald green gown, holding a flute of champagne. She caught my eye across the crowded room. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip from her glass. It was our silent signal. The emergency family court hearing had gone exactly according to our plan that morning. The legal filings were signed, sealed, and currently burning a hole in her designer clutch. Trent's personal bank accounts were already frozen solid, but the banks would not process the notifications until Monday morning. He was currently standing in a rented tuxedo, drinking expensive champagne, totally unaware that he was already a financially ruined man. The whispers around me grew slightly louder, as people tried to figure out why the disgraced widow had shown up to the party. A few guests who knew Declan professionally cast sympathetic glances my way, but most of the crowd was eagerly waiting for a dramatic family meltdown. They wanted to see the unhinged sister make a desperate scene, so Trent could play the noble, long-suffering brother, offering his apologies for my mental state. They definitely wanted a highly spectacular dramatic show, and I was absolutely going to give them a completely unforgettable one tonight right here. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling my heartbeat remain perfectly steady. In my line of work, you never show emotion when executing a hostile takeover. You let the numbers do the talking. The room continued to buzz with anticipation as the clock inched closer to 8. The waitstaff began clearing the appetizer plates and pouring fresh champagne for the upcoming toasts. I watched Howard pat Trent on the back, leaning in to say something that made them both laugh. They were celebrating their impending wealth, convinced that tonight would solve all their problems. The ignorance they displayed was almost profound in its staggering arrogance. The entire facade was about to crumble into dust. They had no idea I was about to unleash absolute hell upon their perfect lives and destroy everything they valued forever. It was time to show them the true cost of betrayal. I stepped away from the marble pillar and glided toward the open bar located at the far end of the room. The bartender, a young man in a starched black vest, poured my sparkling water over crystal-clear ice cubes. I turned my back to the bar, resting my elbows against the polished mahogany edge, and waited. It took exactly 45 seconds for my parents to spot me. I watched them detach themselves from a group of wealthy real estate developers. Beverly's forced camera-ready smile instantly dissolved into a venomous scowl as she grabbed Howard's arm and pointed in my direction. They marched across the ballroom floor with the synchronized aggressive stride of two predators moving in to secure a kill. They were absolutely desperate to intercept me before I could mingle with guests and spread the truth about their precious golden boy. Beverly reached me first. She stepped uncomfortably close, her heavy perfume masking the scent of the expensive gin the bartender was pouring nearby. She grabbed my right forearm, her long manicured acrylic nails digging sharply into the sleeve of my blazer. She violently hissed under her breath, demanding to know what I was doing here and accusing me of trying to humiliate the family in front of Trent's investors. She ordered me to keep my voice down immediately and stop making a pathetic spectacle of myself. I calmly looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, then looked directly into her eyes with an expression so freezing cold that she instinctively let go and took a step backward. I told her I was simply enjoying the complimentary sparkling water tonight and admiring the sheer scale of the massive financial fiction they were funding. Howard stepped up beside her, blocking me from the view of the main ballroom floor. He leaned in, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. His breath smelled heavily of scotch. He stated that they were out of time and out of patience. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek silver fountain pen, along with a blank counter check. He slammed them both onto the damp surface of the bar counter right next to my drink. He commanded me to write the $80,000 check to Apex Innovations right now, claiming it was the only way I could salvage my dignity and save the family's reputation from total ruin. He said Trent needed to show the investors a sudden influx of capital during his presentation. I stared at the blank paper check sitting on the bar, fighting the urge to laugh at their profound ignorance. I asked Howard if he seriously believed a handwritten personal check from a grieving widow would somehow legitimize a failing technology startup to a room full of seasoned venture capitalists. I told him that institutional investors look at strictly audited balance sheets, not personal handouts. Beverly slammed her hand flat against the wooden bar counter, her voice dropping to a vicious, trembling whisper. She told me to stop lecturing them right now with my corporate jargon. She accused me of hoarding Declan's life insurance money out of pure spite. She explicitly stated that Trent's entire future hinged on tonight, and if I did not sign that check immediately, they would ensure my professional career ended by Monday morning. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by the audacity of her threat. I asked how exactly she planned to destroy a career she barely understood. Howard eagerly took the bait, stepping even closer, his face turning a dark red. He threatened to call the senior managing partners at my liquidation firm first thing on Monday. He promised to tell them I was suffering a catastrophic mental breakdown due to my grief over Declan and Mia. He threatened to claim I was acting irrationally, breaching verbal financial contracts, and proving myself entirely unfit to handle sensitive corporate assets. He sneered, stating that nobody hires an unstable, vindictive liquidator who cannot even manage her own household affairs without causing a public scandal. He pointed a finger at the pen and ordered me to sign the check immediately. I picked up the silver fountain pen. Howard and Beverly exchanged a brief, triumphant glance, visibly relaxing as they assumed I was finally capitulating to their aggressive extortion. They thought their psychological warfare had successfully broken the exhausted widow. I held the pen loosely between my fingers, feeling its heavy weight. I looked at my father, my voice completely devoid of fear. I told him he was more than welcome to call the senior partners at my firm. I explained that my partners already knew I was an utterly ruthless executioner when it came to business. I stated that threatening a corporate liquidation specialist with financial ruin is identical to threatening an arsonist with a match. It does not scare me. It only gives me the exact tool I need to burn your entire world to ashes. I dropped the silver pen back onto the bar. It landed with a sharp clatter against the marble. I pushed the blank check back toward Howard, leaving a wet smear across the paper from the condensation on the bar. I told them I was not giving Trent a single penny. I advised them to return to their VIP table and enjoy the overpriced champagne while it lasted. I warned them that Trent was about to take the stage and deliver the most expensive, catastrophic presentation of his entire pathetic life, and they needed to be sitting in the front row to witness every single second of it. Beverly's face contorted with absolute rage. She opened her mouth to scream, completely forgetting about maintaining the quiet country club decorum she worshipped so deeply. Before she could utter a single word, a sharp tap against a microphone echoed loudly through the ballroom speakers. The trap was fully set and the execution was about to begin. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the main event. A spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room, casting a crisp white circle on the polished oak floor. The string quartet faded into a soft, dramatic chord progression before silencing completely. The low murmur of the crowd died down, replaced by the polite, expectant silence of 200 wealthy investors waiting to be entertained. Trent stepped into the spotlight. He was a master of physical performance. He did not strut or swagger. Instead, he walked with a calculated, humble gait, his shoulders slightly stooped, to project the image of a man carrying a profound, invisible weight. He adjusted the microphone on its stand, letting a heavy, poignant silence stretch across the room for exactly 5 seconds before he spoke. He thanked everyone for coming, his voice engineered to sound thick with suppressed emotion. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping the room with manufactured gratitude. He stated that tonight was supposed to be a celebration of Apex innovations, a testament to the relentless drive of his incredible engineering team, and a showcase of the revolutionary platform they were building to connect communities across the globe. He paused again, looking down at his polished dress shoes. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the absolute picture of a man struggling to maintain his composure. He told the audience that while he came here tonight to talk about the future, his heart was inextricably anchored in the past. He stated that true innovation is born from adversity, and true strength is forged in the fires of unimaginable tragedy. He looked up, his eyes shining under the spotlight. He announced that his family had recently suffered a catastrophic, devastating loss. He spoke the names of my husband and my daughter, his voice cracking on the syllables. He claimed that Declan was not just a brother-in-law, but a mentor, a guiding light, and the very foundation of his inspiration. I stood perfectly still near the bar, the cold glass of sparkling water sweating against my palm. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of his performance was breathtaking. He was weaponizing the violent deaths of the man he despised and the niece he ignored to extract seed capital from a room full of empathetic strangers. Trent continued his narrative, weaving a disgusting tapestry of familial devotion. He claimed that losing Declan and Mia had fundamentally altered his perspective on business. He stated that Apex Innovations was no longer just a technology company, it was a mission. He pledged to dedicate the next phase of their expansion to Declan's memory, vowing to build a legacy that would make his fallen brother proud. He spoke about the fragility of life and the paramount importance of investing in the people we love before it is too late. He gestured gracefully toward the VIP table. The spotlight widened to illuminate Howard and Beverly. Howard stood up, placing a comforting hand on Beverly's shoulder. Beverly pulled a lace handkerchief from her clutch and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes, playing the role of the shattered, grieving matriarch to absolute perfection. The crowd murmured in collective sympathy. Several women in the front row actually wiped away genuine tears. Trent turned back to the audience, his expression transitioning from grief to resolute determination. He stated that in the face of such profound darkness, the only way forward was to build something magnificent. He claimed that Apex Innovations was on the precipice of a global breakthrough, but they needed the visionary support of the people in this room to cross the finish line. He promised that every dollar invested tonight was not just funding software, it was funding a family's resilience. It was an investment in the unbreakable human spirit. He concluded his sickening monologue by asking the guests to open their hearts and their portfolios to help him honor Declan's legacy by launching Apex Innovations into the stratosphere. He stepped back from the podium, bowing his head as the ballroom erupted in thunderous standing applause. The investors were completely captivated. They were ready to throw their money at the noble, grieving founder who was bravely channeling his familial tragedy into corporate success. I watched as checkbooks began to appear at tables across the room. Men in tailored suits leaned over to whisper to their wives, nodding in solemn agreement. Trent had played them flawlessly. He had constructed a magnificent bulletproof illusion. It was time to shatter the glass. I set my water glass down on the marble bar. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate, terrifying cadence of an apex predator closing in on a cornered animal. I bypassed the main seating area, slipping seamlessly through the shadows near the ballroom's perimeter until I reached the audio-visual control booth tucked away in the back corner. A young technician wearing a headset was hunched over a massive mixing board preparing to cue up Trent's flashy pitch deck. I stepped into the booth, pulling a heavy encrypted USB drive from the inner pocket of my blazer. I leaned over the technician's shoulder, my voice a quiet, commanding whisper. I told him there had been a slight change in the presentation schedule. I instructed him to plug the drive into the main projection console immediately. He hesitated, looking up at me with confusion. I did not blink. I stared him down with the absolute authority of a woman who owned the building he was sitting in. I repeated the instruction, my tone dropping a fraction of an octave, freezing the air between us. He swallowed hard, took the drive from my fingers, and slotted it into the console. I reached past him and grabbed the spare wireless microphone resting on the mixing board. I flicked the power switch on. A sharp, high-pitched feedback whine briefly cut through the applause in the ballroom, silencing the crowd instantly. I stepped out of the shadows of the audio-visual booth and walked directly into the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The spotlight operator, reacting to the sudden disruption, swung the harsh white beam away from Trent and pinned me in its glaring center. I stood alone in the aisle, surrounded by 200 confused, wealthy investors. Trent stared at me from the stage, his charismatic smile faltering as genuine panic flooded his eyes. Howard and Beverly stood up at their VIP table, their faces draining of all color. I raised the microphone. The execution was ready to commence. I stood in the center aisle, the microphone cold and heavy in my hand. Behind me, in the audio-visual booth, the terrified technician executed my command. A loud digital chime echoed through the grand ballroom as the massive screen above Trent abruptly flickered. The pathetic visionary logo of Apex Innovations vanished completely. In its place, a blindingly bright spreadsheet illuminated the stage. It was the master forensic ledger of M&S Holdings, fully audited, brutally detailed, and completely undeniable. Trent whipped around to look at the screen, his charismatic facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stared at the name of the Nevada shell company Horizon Solutions displayed in massive red font, followed by the exact itemized expenses for his leased Porsche and the luxury downtown apartment. The investors in the room squinted at the screen, their business instincts kicking in as they processed the raw data. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous space, sharp and unyielding. I introduced myself to the room. I stated that my name was Savannah, and I was the widow of the man whose memory they were just asked to finance. I told them that my brother Trent had just delivered a spectacularly moving performance about family values and resilience. However, I explained that, as a professional corporate liquidation specialist, I preferred to rely on audited balance sheets rather than emotional manipulation. I pointed a finger directly at the massive projection screen. I told the 200 wealthy investors to look closely at the numbers displayed behind the supposed visionary tech founder. I explained that they were currently looking at the proprietary financial disclosures of Apex Innovations for the last 2 fiscal quarters. I narrated the data line by line. I highlighted the massive outbound wire transfers categorized as software licensing fees. I revealed that Horizon Solutions was not a software vendor, but a dummy corporation registered to a post office box in Nevada, entirely managed by a 24-year-old influencer. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy venture capitalists, men and women who spent their lives calculating risk, immediately recognized the anatomy of a catastrophic fraud. Checkbooks that had been opened moments ago were swiftly snapped shut. Pens were put away. The atmosphere shifted from sympathetic generosity to absolute freezing hostility. Nobody likes being played for a fool, especially not people holding 7-figure portfolios. Trent lunged toward the edge of the stage. His face was slick with sweat under the harsh stage lights. He shouted into his own microphone, his voice cracking with pure panic. He demanded the technician cut the feed immediately. He yelled that I was suffering a severe mental breakdown, screaming that my grief had made me delusional and vindictive. He begged the investors not to listen to a single word I was saying, claiming the documents on the screen were fabricated. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the undeniable weight of the evidence crush his pathetic lies. I instructed the technician to advance to the next slide on the USB drive. The screen transitioned instantly. A high-resolution photograph filled the massive display. It was a picture of Trent's mistress posing in the driver's seat of the Porsche Panamera, wearing designer sunglasses and smiling brightly. Clearly visible resting on the center console was Trent's hand, easily identifiable by the custom-engraved gold watch Howard had purchased for him 3 years ago. I turned my gaze toward the VIP table. Howard and Beverly were frozen in their seats, staring up at the screen with expressions of absolute suffocating horror. The gold watch was the undeniable smoking gun. Beverly covered her mouth with her hands, her face draining of all blood. Howard gripped the edges of the tablecloth so hard his knuckles turned stark white. They finally understood where the money had gone. They realized they had been hustling a grieving widow to pay for their son's secret mistress. I looked past the stage, finding Kendra in the crowd. She stood perfectly still, her emerald gown catching the light. Her expression was a masterpiece of cold, calculating fury. She was playing her part beautifully, letting the public humiliation wash over Trent before she delivered the lethal personal blow. I paced slowly down the aisle toward the stage, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I told the room that Trent was completely bankrupt. I explained that his revolutionary application had generated absolutely zero revenue in 3 years. I stated that instead of building a technology company, he had been running a highly illegal embezzlement scheme, siphoning corporate operating capital across state lines to fund his own rampant narcissism. I looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes. I spoke into the microphone, ensuring every single guest heard every single syllable. I revealed that just 3 days ago, Trent sent our parents to my house. They ambushed me while I was packing away my dead 4-year-old daughter's toys. I told the silent, horrified ballroom that my family had aggressively demanded I hand over $80,000 from my deceased husband's life insurance policy to cover a supposedly critical payroll shortage. I pointed at the screen again. The red deficit numbers pulsed ominously. I stated that $80,000 was the exact amount Trent had embezzled to pay for that sports car and that luxury apartment over the last 6 months. He was not trying to save his employees. He was attempting to extort a grieving widow to cover up his federal wire fraud before his mandatory financial audit exposed him to criminal indictment. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The entire room waited in breathless silence for his defense, but there was absolutely nothing he could say to save himself now. I had completely trapped him inside a flawless, unbreakable cage of his own making, and the true execution had not even officially started yet. I stood perfectly still in the center aisle, letting the suffocating silence stretch across the grand ballroom. The wealthy investors surrounding me were completely motionless. They stared at the giant projection screen displaying Trent's mistress and the embezzled funds, then shifted their collective gaze back to the man sweating profusely on the stage. Trent was clutching the edges of the podium so tightly his hands were shaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He tried to laugh, a pathetic, wet sound that echoed terribly through the microphone. He stammered that this was a massive misunderstanding and claimed I was just a confused, grieving widow lashing out at the world. I raised my microphone and stepped closer to the stage. I told him to stop insulting the intelligence of every venture capitalist in the room. I explained that seasoned investors know exactly what fraudulent expenditures look like. I turned to face the audience, addressing the men and women who had been reaching for their checkbooks just 10 minutes ago. I asked them to recall the story Trent had been telling them for the past 2 years. I reminded them how Trent bragged endlessly about securing a $1.5 million bridge loan from a highly exclusive anonymous Silicon Valley private equity firm. Trent flinched at the mention of his initial funding. He tried to interrupt me, shouting that his financial backers demanded strict confidentiality and that I had no right to discuss his corporate capitalization table in a public setting. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority, and commanded me to leave the stage area before he called security. He stated that his primary investor was a ruthless corporate titan who would crush anyone interfering with Apex Innovations. I smiled at him. It was a cold, sharp expression entirely devoid of any warmth. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. His primary investor was indeed a ruthless corporate titan. I instructed the young technician in the audiovisual booth to advance the presentation to the final slide. A loud mechanical click sounded through the speakers as the image of the mistress vanished. The screen was immediately filled with a highly classified legal document. It was the master operating agreement and state registration for a private equity shell company. The massive bold letters at the top of the document spelled out M&S Holdings LLC. I turned back to the crowd. I asked them to read the names listed under the executive founding members. The investors in the front row squinted at the screen. A prominent local hedge fund manager read the name aloud. He said the founder was Declan. He looked at me, his eyes widening in sudden profound comprehension. I nodded slowly. I spoke directly into the microphone, ensuring my voice resonated with crystal clarity. I told the room that my brilliant late husband Declan was the anonymous angel investor who saved Apex Innovations from total collapse 2 years ago. I explained that Declan had used his personal wealth to fund M&S Holdings entirely in secret because he knew his brother-in-law was a financial parasite. Declan knew Trent would inevitably burn through the capital, and he wanted an ironclad legal mechanism to hold Trent completely accountable when the inevitable default occurred. Trent physically staggered backward. He collided with the digital presentation screen, his mouth hanging wide open. He stared at the name of my dead husband, printed on his master debt agreement. The realization struck him with the force of a freight train. He had spent the last 2 years bragging about his elite Silicon Valley backers, completely unaware he was actually begging for survival money from the brother-in-law he openly mocked at every family dinner. I did not give him a single second to recover. I told the audience to look closely at the second name listed on the corporate registration document right below Declan. I stated that M and S stood for Mia and Savannah. I explained that upon the tragic deaths of my husband and my 4-year-old daughter, the executive power of the LLC automatically transferred to the sole surviving beneficiary. I took another step toward the stage. I looked directly into Trent's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I formally introduced myself to the silent ballroom. I announced that I was no longer standing before them as the grieving, vulnerable sister they thought they could manipulate. I declared that I was Savannah, the new president, chief executive officer, and 100% equity owner of M&S Holdings, LLC. I stated with absolute legal authority that I was the primary secured creditor of Apex Innovations. I owned his debt. I owned his company. The silence that fell over the country club was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, breathless quiet that occurs right before a massive structural collapse. 200 elite socialites and cutthroat investors stopped breathing. They stared at me in pure, unadulterated awe. They were witnessing a legendary corporate execution happening live in evening wear. I glanced over at the VIP table. Howard and Beverly were clutching each other, their faces completely drained of blood. Howard looked like he was struggling to process oxygen. Beverly was gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were white. They finally understood the magnitude of their colossal mistake. They realized that when they showed up at my house demanding $80,000, they were not bullying a helpless widow. They were trying to extort the very woman who held the execution warrant for their entire financial existence. Trent dropped his microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a deafening screech of feedback that made several guests wince. He fell to his knees, his tailored tuxedo pants hitting the polished oak boards. He raised his hands toward me, his face slick with sweat and tears of genuine panic. He finally understood that I had not come to the gala to make a scene or throw a tantrum. I had come to liquidate his life. He opened his mouth to beg for mercy, but the true legal devastation was only just beginning. Trent remained on his knees, his tailored tuxedo pants soaking up the spilled champagne from a dropped glass nearby. He opened his mouth again, a pathetic, gasping sound escaping his throat as he tried to formulate a coherent plea. He raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender, begging me to stop pleading with me not to do this in front of his investors. He whispered that we were family, that we could go into a private room and work out a payment plan, that he would do whatever I wanted if I just turned off the projector. I looked down at him with a gaze so devoid of empathy it could have frozen boiling water. I told him that begging is an emotional response to a strictly mathematical problem, and as a corporate liquidator, I do not negotiate with insolvent debtors. I stepped past him, turning my attention back to the audience of venture capitalists and angel investors who were watching this spectacle with morbid, captivated fascination. I spoke clearly into the microphone. I told the room that every seasoned investor present understands the rigorous mechanics of mezzanine financing. I explained that my late husband Declan was a brilliant financier, but above all else he was an incredibly cautious one. When he agreed to issue the $1.5 million bridge loan to Apex Innovations 2 years ago, he deliberately structured the debt to include a highly specific, non-negotiable set of financial covenants. He knew Trent lacked the discipline to manage capital, so he built a legal fail-safe to protect his investment. I projected my voice, ensuring it reached the farthest corners of the grand ballroom. I stated that Section 4, Paragraph B of the Master Operating Agreement clearly stipulates that any diversion of corporate operating capital for non-approved personal expenditures constitutes an immediate material breach of contract. I added that Section 5 outlines the mandatory cure period for any defaulted interest payments. I turned back to Trent, who was visibly trembling on the stage floor. I reminded everyone that Trent had entirely missed his last 2 interest payments to M&S Holdings. I reiterated that he missed those payments because he was actively transferring exactly $80,000 to a 24-year-old influencer in Nevada, funding a luxury high-rise apartment and a brand-new Porsche Panamera. I stated that the strict 90-day cure period for those defaulted payments officially expired at exactly midnight last night. The clock had run out, and the legal grace period was entirely exhausted. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a thick, crisp, formally notarized legal document printed on heavy stock paper. I held it up for the entire ballroom to see. I announced that this document was an official notice of acceleration and demand for payment. I explained the concept of callable debt to the silent crowd. I stated that because Trent had committed heavily documented financial fraud, engaged in active embezzlement, and catastrophically breached his core operating covenants, the entirety of his corporate debt was now fully callable. I declared that I was legally executing that specific clause right now live on stage in front of every single person he had attempted to defraud tonight. I walked directly up to Trent and dropped the heavy legal document onto the polished oak floor right between his trembling hands. I spoke with absolute crushing finality. I told him that as the president and sole equity owner of M&S Holdings, I was officially calling in the entire loan. I demanded immediate repayment of the original $1.5 million principal, plus all accrued unpaid interest, compounding default penalties, and comprehensive legal fees. I stated that the total sum was due immediately payable right this exact second. Trent stared at the legal document as if it were a venomous snake. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his charismatic facade entirely obliterated. He stammered frantically, his voice echoing through the ballroom. He cried out that I knew he did not have that kind of liquidity. He sobbed that he did not have $1.5 million in cash sitting in a bank account. He begged me to give him 30 days, promising he could secure a new round of funding and pay me back every single cent. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his level. I told him that corporate liquidators do not grant 30-day extensions to executives who steal from their own ledgers. I stated that his inability to pay the callable debt immediately meant only one thing in the eyes of the law. He was completely and irrevocably insolvent. I stood back up and addressed the crowd once more. I revealed the final piece of the financial trap I had set. I informed Trent and the stunned investors that at exactly 8:15 this evening, an automated legal directive was dispatched from my corporate attorneys to every single financial institution holding an Apex Innovations account. I explained that as the senior secured creditor possessing the primary lien on all his intellectual property and corporate cash flows, I had instituted a total impenetrable freeze on all his business assets. I looked down at Trent, delivering the ultimate death blow to his visionary ego. I told him he could not move a single dollar. I stated he could not pay his vendors, he could not pay his developers, and he could not even pay the country club catering staff for the expensive shrimp cocktail his guests were currently eating. His company was financially paralyzed, locked down by court order, and entirely stripped of any remaining capital. A heavy final realization washed over the ballroom. The wealthy investors looked at the weeping man on the stage and realized they had just dodged a massive, catastrophic financial bullet. They recognized the sheer brutality and absolute legality of the execution I had just performed. I delivered the final verdict into the microphone. I declared that because he could not service the accelerated debt, and because his assets were completely frozen by his senior creditor, Apex Innovations was officially, legally, and practically bankrupt. I announced that his company was dead right here live on stage, and I was the one pulling the plug. The reverberation of my final declaration hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. Trent remained slumped on the floor, a weeping, broken shell of a man. The sheer finality of the moment finally penetrated the deep shock gripping the VIP table. A heavy wooden chair violently screeched against the marble floor. Howard and Beverly erupted from their seats, their faces twisted into masks of feral, unhinged rage. They completely abandoned their carefully cultivated high society personas, storming down the center aisle like enraged bulls. Beverly reached the edge of the stage first, her sequined gown glittering harshly under the spotlights. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my face, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent room. She screamed that I was a psychotic, vindictive monster. She yelled that I was deliberately destroying my own flesh and blood out of pure, petty jealousy. Howard climbed the short staircase to the stage, his heavy breathing audible through the microphone I still held. He stood between me and his weeping son, positioning himself as the valiant protector. He shouted that I had lost my mind, claiming my grief had turned me into a bitter, hateful woman. He roared that I had no right to hijack a private corporate event to air my delusional grievances. He promised to sue me for every penny I possessed, threatening to drag me through the courts for defamation and tortious interference. He demanded I retract my statements and apologize to the investors immediately, insisting I was ruining the family name forever. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my face an absolute impenetrable fortress of corporate apathy. I let their screams wash over me, completely unaffected by their frantic emotional blackmail. I raised the microphone back to my lips, cutting through their hysterical tirade. I calmly stated that they were the ones who brought business into my home 3 days ago. I reminded them that they ambushed me in my foyer while I was packing my dead daughter's stuffed animals into cardboard boxes. I told the captivated audience that Howard and Beverly had aggressively demanded $80,000 from my husband's life insurance payout. I explained that they had the audacity to call the funeral of my husband and child a trivial event not worth attending simply because they refused to cancel their luxury ski vacation in Aspen. I stated that they threatened to disown me if I did not fund Trent's embezzlement. A collective gasp rose from the shocked venture capitalists in the room. The wealthy elite looked at my parents with profound disgust. Howard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged forward, barking that I was twisting the facts. He yelled that family helps family in times of crisis, and that a successful tech enterprise occasionally needs a temporary capital injection. He screamed that I could not just arbitrarily kill a multi-million-dollar company because I was angry about a missed funeral. He insisted that Trent's intellectual property was worth 10 times the loan amount. I offered him a terrifyingly serene smile. I agreed that collateral is indeed the foundation of any secure mezzanine financing agreement. I turned my attention back to the audio-visual booth. I signaled the technician with a sharp nod of my head. The digital chime echoed again, and the massive projection screen behind us instantly transitioned to the next slide. A highly detailed, heavily redacted legal document filled the display. The title at the top read, Commercial Pledge and Security Agreement. I turned back to my father, my eyes locking onto his. I informed him that Trent did not secure the $1.5 million bailout loan with his startup's software code. I explained that institutional investors do not accept vaporware as collateral. I told Howard that to guarantee the massive influx of capital, Trent had to provide a hard physical asset of equivalent value. I directed Howard and Beverly to look closely at the screen. I carefully instructed them to read the property description block highlighted in bright neon yellow. Howard slowly turned his head. His eyes scanned the projected document. Beverly gasped, clutching her throat as if she were actively suffocating. Displayed in massive bold font on the screen was the exact street address of their sprawling $1.2 million suburban estate. The very house they slept in every single night. The absolute fortress of their fake upper-class prestige was projected for absolutely everyone to see. I slowly walked toward them, my voice dropping to a lethal, authoritative pitch. I explained that 2 years ago Trent secretly collateralized their primary residence to secure his anonymous funding. I pointed to the final page of the document shown on the screen. I highlighted the 2 signatures resting at the bottom of the page, fully notarized and legally binding. I told Howard and Beverly that Trent had manipulated them into signing a commercial guarantee stripping them of their home equity to fund his fraudulent empire. I stated that because Trent had failed to cure his defaulted interest payments, the entire principal was due immediately. Since Trent was utterly bankrupt and his corporate assets were frozen, the massive debt collection automatically transferred to the guarantors. I reached into my tailored blazer one final time. I pulled out a heavy folded legal packet and slammed it directly into Howard's chest. He frantically grabbed it instinctively. I announced that this was an official notice of default and intent to foreclose. I declared that as the sole owner of M&S Holdings, I was formally seizing their physical collateral. I told them they had exactly 14 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to physically remove their belongings and permanently change the locks. I stared at the two people who had tormented me my entire life. I stated clearly that their home now belonged to me. I had just legally and permanently evicted my parents in front of the entire country club. Howard stared down at the thick foreclosure packet resting in his trembling hands. The glossy veneer of his prestige violently peeled away, exposing the pathetic bankrupt man underneath. Beverly let out a strangled sound and physically collapsed against the edge of the stage. Her knees gave out under the crushing weight of her new reality. She gripped the velvet skirting, her manicured nails catching in the fabric as she stared blankly at the floor. They had spent decades judging my worth, demanding I cater to their lavish lifestyle, and now they were effectively homeless. I did not offer them a single ounce of pity. I simply stepped past their broken forms, shifting my focus back to the primary target. Trent was still kneeling on the wooden floor watching his parents disintegrate. He realized instantly that Howard and Beverly could no longer protect him. Their money was gone. Their house was gone. Their social standing was eradicated. Panicking, his bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the silent ballroom until they landed on the only remaining pillar of his fraudulent life. He frantically searched for his wife. He spotted Kendra standing near the grand entrance, draped in her emerald green gown, her posture immaculate and completely unbothered. Trent let out a desperate sob. He crawled forward to the edge of the stage, reaching his hands out toward her, like a drowning man grasping for a life preserver. He begged her to come up to the stage. He cried out to the silent audience that this was all a massive misunderstanding, a cruel setup orchestrated by an unstable widow. He pleaded with Kendra to stand by his side, invoking their marriage, their 3 children, and the vows they took. He desperately tried to leverage her pristine reputation as a dedicated hospital administrator to shield himself from the absolute ruin I had just inflicted upon him. He yelled that he loved her, that he was a devoted family man, and that they would get through this vicious attack together. He reached his hand out, fully expecting her to fiercely defend his honor against my corporate execution. Kendra did not rush. She did not look embarrassed, and she certainly did not look eager to comfort her distressed husband. She walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate grace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. The wealthy investors parted like the Red Sea, stepping back to give her a wide berth. The sharp click of her heels echoed loudly against the marble floor, matching the exact predatory cadence I had used moments earlier. She bypassed Howard and Beverly without glancing at them, stepping gracefully up the short staircase onto the stage. She stood over Trent, looking down at his weeping form. She did not reach out to hold his hands. She simply stared at him with absolute Arctic disgust. Trent looked up at her, tears streaming down his face, a hopeful smile attempting to break through his panic. He reached out to grab the fabric of her gown. Kendra took a swift step back, denying him even the slightest physical contact. She reached into her elegant designer clutch and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed legal envelope. She did not hand it to him gently. She threw it directly at his chest. The heavy packet struck his tuxedo shirt and landed on the wooden stage floor with a loud smack. Trent stared at the envelope, confusion washing over his tear-stained face. He asked her what this was, his voice cracking horribly through the microphone that still lay near his knees. Kendra did not require a microphone. Her voice was sharp, commanding, and projected perfectly across the dead silent ballroom. She announced that those were expedited divorce papers, effective immediately. She stated she had spent the entire morning in an emergency ex parte hearing with a family court judge. She declared she had officially filed for full sole legal and physical custody of their 3 sons. A collective murmur rippled through the stunned audience. Trent gasped, clutching his chest as if she had physically stabbed him. He begged her to stop, insisting they could fix this privately, behind closed doors. Kendra cut him off with a voice as sharp as a diamond blade. She told him she had also secured an emergency judicial order freezing every single one of his personal assets. She explained to the packed room that my corporate team had locked down his business accounts, but her legal team had successfully locked down his personal wealth. She stated he could not access their joint checking accounts, he could not touch his personal investment portfolios, and his passport was legally flagged and restricted. Trent stammered wildly, asking how a judge could grant an emergency asset freeze without giving him a chance to defend himself. Kendra leaned down slightly, bringing her face inches from his sweating forehead. She told him judges act swiftly when a mother presents irrefutable banking evidence of a father robbing his own children. The ballroom went completely still. Even Howard and Beverly looked up from their shock. Kendra stood tall, turning her fierce gaze to the audience of investors and socialites. She announced that Trent did not just embezzle corporate funds to pay for his mistress and luxury sports car. She revealed that when Trent ran out of business capital to steal, he secretly liquidated the college savings accounts belonging to their 3 young boys. She stated he drained hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for their future education, incurring massive tax penalties just to funnel cash into his Nevada shell company to keep his mistress clothed in designer apparel. The wealthy elite gasped in genuine unfiltered horror. In their cutthroat world, aggressive corporate restructuring was business as usual, but stealing a child's educational trust fund to pay for an affair was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. The remaining shreds of Trent's reputation instantly vaporized into nothingness. The investors looked at him not just as a bankrupt fraud, but as a completely repulsive monster. Kendra looked down at the man she had married, her expression devoid of any residual affection. She told him he was a parasite who fed on the people who loved him. She stated he had financially ruined his parents, attempted to extort his grieving sister, and violently robbed his own flesh and blood. She declared he was leaving this country club tonight with absolutely nothing. He had no company, no home, no money, no parents willing to shelter him, and no family left to manipulate. She turned her back on his weeping, pathetic form and walked off the stage, her head held high, leaving him entirely alone in the blinding white spotlight. The rhythmic click of Kendra's heels faded into the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. Trent remained completely immobilized on the stage floor. He stared out at the sea of wealthy investors, his face a grotesque mask of absolute despair. He frantically wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a dark smear across his pale skin. He foolishly raised a trembling hand toward a prominent venture capitalist seated in the front row, a man he had confidently played golf with just yesterday morning. He gasped the man's name, pleading for a chance to explain, begging for a private meeting to restructure the debt and clear up the massive misunderstanding. The venture capitalist did not utter a single syllable. He simply picked up his crystal glass, turned his chair completely around, and presented his back to the stage. It was a silent, brutal decree of total excommunication. Within seconds, the entire front row followed suit. The local elite, men and women who guarded their reputations with lethal precision, physically turned their backs on my brother. Trent was no longer a visionary founder. He was a radioactive liability, a financial pariah permanently exiled from the only world he cared about. Down at the base of the stage, the reality of this absolute social and financial annihilation finally breached Howard's arrogant psychological defenses. The realization that he was losing his sprawling suburban estate, his exclusive country club membership, his luxury vehicles, and his son's fake empire hit his nervous system like a massive jolt of electricity. Howard clutched the lapels of his custom tuxedo, his fingers twisting the expensive fabric into tight knots. The sharp pain in his chest mirrored the sudden realization of his total destitution. He let out a ragged, wheezing gasp, his chest heaving as he desperately fought for oxygen that his lungs refused to process. His face rapidly shifted from a furious crimson to a terrifying, sickly shade of gray. He staggered backward, knocking over a towering floral arrangement of white hydrangeas. the heavy crystal vase shattered loudly against the polished marble floor, scattering ice water and crushed petals around his expensive shoes. Howard collapsed onto his hands and knees, his breath hitching in rapid, terrifying intervals. It was a full-blown panic attack triggered by the sudden, violent evaporation of his entire fake reality. The wealthy socialite standing near him did not rush forward to offer medical assistance. They instinctively took several large steps back, pulling their expensive evening gowns away from the puddle of water, treating my hyperventilating father like a contagious disease they desperately needed to avoid. Beverly watched her husband collapse to the marble floor, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She looked up at Trent, who was still weeping uselessly on the stage, and then she turned her frantic, bloodshot eyes toward me. The arrogant, condescending matriarch, who had ambushed me in my foyer 3 days ago, completely vanished. She scrambled across the wet marble, her expensive sequined gown dragging through the crushed hydrangea petals. She practically threw herself at my feet, her hands desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored black blazer. I stepped back quickly, denying her the satisfaction of physical contact, forcing her to kneel on the cold, wet floor. Beverly looked up at me, expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, completely destroying her flawless country club facade. She sobbed, her voice, a pathetic high-pitched whine echoing in the quiet room. She begged me for mercy, crying that I had made my point and proven my power over them. She pleaded with me not to take their home, insisting that they were old and had absolutely nowhere else to go. She wailed that we were family, that we shared the exact same blood, and that a daughter could not possibly throw her own parents out into the freezing street. She promised to visit the cemetery every day, crying that they were sorry that they made a terrible mistake, and that they would do absolutely anything to make it right if I just tore up the foreclosure notice immediately. I looked down at the weeping woman clutching her chest on the ballroom floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no residual daughterly affection. My heart was a perfectly calibrated machine devoid of any emotional vulnerability. I looked past her, sweeping my gaze over my hyperventilating father and my destroyed brother. I spoke with a voice so cold and quiet it chilled the air around us. I told Beverly to save her theatrical tears, because I was not a judge, and this was not a courtroom where fake remorse held any currency. I stated that 3 days ago, I stood in the freezing rain watching 2 mahogany caskets being lowered into the mud. I reminded her that I buried the absolute love of my life and my innocent 4-year-old baby girl entirely alone, surrounded by nothing but empty folding chairs. I leaned down slightly, making sure my words pierced directly through her panic. I quoted her exact text message back to her, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. I reminded her that she called the burial of my husband and my daughter a trivial event not worth attending. I stated that she explicitly prioritized a luxury ski vacation in Aspen over the darkest, most agonizing day of my entire existence. I explained that when she sent that message, she did not just break my heart. She completely severed the biological contract between us forever. I straightened my posture, looking down at my parents with absolute, uncompromising finality. I told them that because burying my family was a trivial event to them, foreclosing on their estate, destroying their reputation, and liquidating their entire financial existence was a completely trivial event to me. I stated that I felt no remorse for evicting strangers who attempted to extort a grieving widow to fund a criminal enterprise. I declared that their debt was called, their assets were seized, and their family name was permanently ruined. I advised them to use whatever spare change they had left in their pockets to call a moving company because the county sheriff would arrive exactly 14 days from tomorrow. I did not wait for Beverly to respond. I turned my back on her weeping form, stepped over the shattered crystal vase on the floor, and walked purposefully toward the grand exit of the ballroom. The wealthy elite parted for me in absolute respectful silence. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the wreckage of my former family behind me, stepping out into the crisp, clean night air, ready to rebuild my life entirely on my own terms. 6 months passed since that night at the country club. The aftermath of my execution was swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. Trent did not just lose his fake startup and his rented tuxedo. When I froze his corporate accounts and handed the forensic audit over to the authorities, the federal government took an immediate interest in his financial gymnastics. Last Tuesday, Trent was formally indicted by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The charges included multiple counts of federal wire fraud, gross tax evasion, and the embezzlement of corporate funds across state lines. The young influencer in Nevada flipped on him immediately, handing over every text message and bank receipt, proving he used investor capital to fund their lavish lifestyle. Trent is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial. He was denied bail because he is considered a severe flight risk, completely stripped of his passport and any access to liquid cash. His visionary entrepreneur facade has been permanently replaced by an orange jumpsuit. He will likely spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary, finally paying the true cost for his overwhelming narcissism. Howard and Beverly experienced a completely different kind of prison. Exactly 14 days after I dropped the foreclosure notice on the ballroom floor, the county sheriff arrived at their sprawling suburban estate. They were physically escorted off the property, while a moving crew packed their expensive furniture into storage units they could barely afford. Today, my parents live in a cramped rental apartment situated directly next to a noisy interstate highway. Their exclusive country club memberships were instantly revoked due to unpaid dues and the sheer social toxicity of their public scandal. The wealthy elite they spent their entire lives trying to impress completely erased them from their social calendars. Howard was forced to take a humiliating minimum wage job just to keep the lights on, while Beverly spends her days trapped in that tiny apartment, isolated from the luxury she sacrificed her own daughter to maintain. They tried calling me a few times during the first month, leaving desperate weeping voicemails begging for financial forgiveness. I never listened to a single one. I simply blocked their numbers legally, ensuring they could never infiltrate my peace again. While my biological family faced their rightful ruin, the family I chose to protect thrived beautifully. Kendra executed her legal strategy with flawless, breathtaking precision. The emergency asset freeze she secured before the gala completely locked Trent out of their joint accounts. During the divorce proceedings, my legal team worked closely with her attorney to reclassify the stolen college funds as a priority marital debt. Through the meticulous liquidation of Trent's remaining physical assets, Kendra successfully recovered every single dollar he had drained from their children's educational trusts. She won full sole legal and physical custody of her 3 boys. Trent is legally barred from contacting them. Free from the massive financial and emotional anchor of her narcissistic husband, Kendra flourished. She received a massive promotion at the hospital, taking over as the chief administrative director for the entire regional healthcare network. We meet for coffee every other Thursday, not as grieving women, but as 2 victorious conquerors who burned a toxic empire to protect our futures. As for myself, I refuse to let the legacy of M&S Holdings be defined by my brother's pathetic fraud. The capital Declan had amassed was not meant to destroy lives, it was meant to build them. I completely restructured the private equity firm. I transformed M&S Holdings into a venture capital fund exclusively focused on empowering female entrepreneurs, independent mothers, and widows trying to rebuild their independence. I use my expertise as a corporate liquidator to audit their business plans, ensuring they have the structural integrity to survive brutal market conditions. I provide the capital they need to launch their dreams without the predatory terms demanded by traditional banks. Every successful business we launch, every woman we elevate to financial freedom is a direct tribute to the brilliant, generous man who built the foundation of this fund. Declan wanted to protect me from the viciousness of the world, and now I use his shield to protect hundreds of other women who refuse to be victims. Mia would have grown up to be a fiercely independent woman, and through this fund, her name helps other women achieve exactly that. This morning, the Seattle sky was not weeping. The sun shone brightly, casting warm golden light across the manicured green lawns of the cemetery. I walked down the familiar paved path, my footsteps light and steady. I was not wearing a heavy black wool coat today. I wore a bright, elegant floral dress, embracing the warmth of the new season. I reached the two marble headstones resting side by side beneath a large, sprawling oak tree. I knelt on the soft grass, placing a vibrant bouquet of fresh yellow sunflowers between their markers. I traced my fingers over Declan's carved name, then gently touched the small, delicate letters spelling out Mia. I did not feel the crushing weight of grief that had paralyzed me 6 months ago. Instead, a profound, unshakable peace settled deeply into my bones. I looked at the bright blue sky above the oak branches, feeling the gentle breeze brush against my face. I spoke to them softly, my voice steady and clear. I told them that the storm was finally over. I explained that the parasites who tried to feed on their memory had been completely eradicated, and the assets they left behind were planting seeds of hope across the city. I smiled, a genuine expression that reached my eyes. I stood up, taking one last peaceful look at their resting place. I promised I would continue to build a magnificent, unbreakable legacy in their honor. I turned and walked back down the sunlit path, my head held high, stepping into a beautiful, unwritten future, entirely under my own control. The most profound lesson from Savannah's journey is that biology does not grant a free pass for abuse or exploitation. We are often conditioned to believe that we owe our families endless forgiveness even when they treat our deepest tragedies as trivial inconveniences. However, true security comes from recognizing your own worth and ruthlessly cutting ties with parasitic relationships. Setting ironclad boundaries isn't cruel. It is a necessary act of profound self-love and survival. You have the absolute right to liquidate toxic ties and build your own empire from the ashes. Have you ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.